Okay, folks, I think I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Again, welcome everybody. I'm Eli Sagor with the University of Minnesota. Really glad to have folks here. I said kind of apologetically to Jim, there are sort of tumbleweeds blowing through campus today. We're here in Green Hall on the St. Paul campus of the university. Graduation was last week, finals ended a few days back, and it's quiet around here. So we're glad that you, those of you out around the state, have been able to join us. We will be recording this session. This is the fourth, I believe, webinar in the webinar series offered by the University of Minnesota Extension and the Sustainable Forest Education Co-op. Today, we're really pleased to have Jim Bowyer. Jim is former faculty member here, retired a few years ago from the College of Food, Ag, and Natural Resource Sciences. He's a very well-known speaker, gives a lot of talks every year on topics related to what he'll be discussing today. We invited Jim for a variety of reasons. One, he's just a very good speaker. And two, this talk is a little bit different from what we normally offer. Jim takes a perspective, kind of a higher level perspective on the environmental impacts of the kind of work that many of us do, resource management around the state, a different perspective from what we normally are accustomed to hearing. And I think it's really a very useful perspective as we think about how we communicate with the public and as we
We had a temperature warning.
Oh, funny.
So we can still see everything online.
Okay, great. Well, gee, I'm going to apologize for that. We have our projector just blew out here in St. Paul. So we're going to go on faith here that we can, that everything is still going out. We'll all be monitoring things. But Jim, this will be a little bit funny for you to be presenting without a screen here in the room. So with that, Jim Bowyer, welcome.
Okay, good morning, everybody, or I guess it's noon. All right, we're going to talk about life cycle assessment of forestry operations. And I've been told, or I'm kind of the view, that LCA is not something that foresters know a whole lot about or are exposed to in education. But if you're one of those people who hasn't run into LCA before, you quickly need to find out a little bit of what it's all about, I would say. And I'm punching the arrows here, Eli, and they're not going anywhere. So we're 2 minutes in and we already have a problem.
No, we're not.
There we go. All right. All right, so what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes, I'm just going to talk about basics of life cycle assessment, and then a little bit about its application to forestry operations. So we'll talk about objectives and scope and something called system boundaries, and then we'll get into the whole business of inventory, life cycle inventory, which really is the first and most important step in the whole process. Then we'll talk about impact assessment, improvement assessment. Then I'm going to talk a bit about LCA and landscape impacts. That's an area where there's a lot of misunderstanding today. We'll talk a bit about forest carbon dynamics, and this is an issue which in some circles is a really big deal today. So we're going to spend a bit of time on that, and I'll wander a little bit off the topic of LCA in that discussion, but on the other hand, it's applicable. And so the carbon debt debate is what I'll spend quite a bit of time on, and then we'll wrap up. So life cycle assessment. What life cycle assessment is all about is systematic accounting of environmental impacts. And the whole idea in life cycle assessment is to provide a firm basis for determining what environmental impacts are of a product, a process, a series of processes. And it approaches this task very systematically, attempting to take bias and emotion and all those kinds of things out of the process so that what you have is reproducible results. So life cycle assessment looks like this. Start with the upper left. First, and I'll talk about each of these things in just a minute. But the first thing that is done is to define the scope of what it is we want to do. When we decide to do an assessment, the first thing is important to decide is, well, what are we going to do? What's the scope of what we're going to do? and so on. And in that discussion, we'll talk about system boundaries. So we gather a bunch of information after goal and scope is determined. We do an inventory analysis. That's the part of an LCA that really takes the most time. And then we use that information in different ways. So we do an impact assessment, and then we look at what is the implications for applications, strategic planning and process improvement and all that kind of thing. And we'll come back and talk about that. So first of all, let's look at this whole business about defining a scope of an LCA. Well, first I'll show you the series of steps. We have define the scope, we measure, do an inventory, we evaluate what the inventory told us, and then we consider, well, what can we do with this information? So let's look first at scope. So here's what an LCA, we're first starting to think about an LCA, and we're thinking, all right, we're going to do an LCA of forest harvesting. So the first thing we'll do is we'll kind of think about all of the steps that might be involved. So we're going to prepare the site, we're going to plant, we're going to do some treatments. All of this, of course, going to take place before a harvest occurs. Then we're going to fell trees and skid them and cut them to length and load them, take them to the landing, and maybe load them onto a truck. So let's think about, well, maybe those are the things we want to figure out. What are the environmental impacts of that series of operations? We also have to ask ourselves a series of questions. Do we want to go all the way to loading on a truck, or do we want to stop this assessment just at the cut to length operation? We could do that, but we want to decide that at the beginning, that's what our scope would be. Do we want to take these logs, not only do we want to load them on a truck, but maybe we want to consider what is the impact of transporting these to the mill, and now our output will be logs in a mill yard. What does that look like? If that's our objective, we need to define that right up front. What about the whole business of the stand? I mean, do we want to start this assessment at the time of harvest, or do we want to think about what happened before trees were harvested, the growing of trees? And if we do, what about growing of seedlings in a nursery? Do we need to look at the life cycle impacts of that operation as part of the whole thing we're looking at? Very well might want to do that. But again, if so, we need to define that at the outset. And then you can really get in the weeds and think about this. Okay, we're doing a life cycle assessment, but how far back do we go? Like, for instance, do we consider the life cycle impacts of building that skidder? And if we say yes to that, what about the machine that was used to build the parts that made the skidder? What about the machine that made the parts to build the machine that, you know? So at some point it doesn't make any sense, and a number of studies have been done on this, and generally what has been found is that you don't need to count the environmental impact of producing the machines that you're going to use, unless, asterisk, those machines last a very short period of time. So the skidder, would you count a skidder? Well, if you're using a skidder in a tropical environment, I used to be associated with the Tropical Forest Foundation, and we were running operations in tropical Brazil. Well, there a skidder in that kind of environment was pretty much done after about 3 years. And so then it made sense, you start looking at that, you did need to count what the impact of that skidder was in the process of making it, so on. What about the skidder tires? Very often skidder tires, especially if you're in rough terrain, rocky terrain, they don't last very long. Again, you look at those and there's actually a protocol you go through to see whether you count them or whether you don't. Anyway, those are the kind of questions that you ask in deciding what is the scope of the study. This little dashed line that you see here, right here, that line is called the system boundary. And so as I've shown you, you can move that system boundary around, and that system boundary defines what it is you're going to study in a life cycle assessment. Okay, so we've decided what it is we're going to do, and I guess we'll come back to that and say, all right, in this discussion, we'll talk about we're going to go all the way from from site preparation, and we're going to fell trees, and then we're going to reforest the site, basically. And then we're going to go all the way to loading of logs on the truck. Okay, so then we go to the measurement, the life cycle inventory stage, which I've said is really the most important or the most time consuming, at least, part of this whole exercise. And so remember, the life cycle assessment is all about things that are measurable, reproducible, and so on. So I can do this kind of a study, and then another research team can come in and do the same study, and they should get the same results if we do a life cycle assessment in accordance with international protocols. Okay, so in the life cycle inventory, we're going to look at measurable things. We're going to look at raw material inputs and products and byproducts, emissions, effluents, waste. We're going to measure all this stuff. So for burning fuel, we're going to measure how much fuel goes in. We're going to measure CO2, CO, methane, all the other kinds of things that come out of the process. And we're going to do that. If you go through a whole life cycle inventory, you would start with extraction of raw materials, maybe even, or maybe to include reforestation of the site if we're talking about forest products, and then go all the way through the process, development of products to semi-finished, finished products, and you might even take this further into maintenance cycles and disposal and reuse. So in my work over the last quite a number of years, the products that I've been looking at is buildings. I mean, it's a fairly complicated product. So in a life cycle assessment of the building, you literally look at every nail, every screw, every component that goes in the building. You track it all the way back to its extraction of raw materials used to make it, all the process and so forth. So what you've got is this enormous, complicated, but nonetheless, at its base, it's an accounting system. And you add all of that up, and then you bring it back together. But in this case, our inventory, we're going to focus only on extraction. Okay. And by the way, I should mention that in doing life cycle inventory work, there have been quite a number of studies done on logging processes in different parts of the country, in different types of terrain, using different types of equipment. And so if this is done correctly and done according to international protocols, what can happen is, or what happens is that you produce modules that actually can be figuratively plugged together into another module, depending upon where logs and output from logging go. So there's a lot of work has already been done in this area. So we're going to focus on extraction, maybe some transportation, and we're going to look at replanting, restoring the site after we're done. Okay, so here's our life cycle inventory. So notice over to the left, we're looking at inputs. So inputs would be things like diesel fuel, gasoline, lubricants, fertilizer if we're using that as we establish the site, maybe herbicides if they're part of the picture here. We'll look at seedlings and the development of those. So those are the inputs. And the outputs here, and by the way, I list seedlings as inputs. So in our life cycle inventory, I've drawn this system boundary so that we don't figure out what the life cycle impacts are of producing seedlings. That's the way I've drawn system boundary. Could have drawn it differently, but in this case, seedlings are an input. Outputs are things like pulpwood, saw logs, logging slash, if we're collecting that slash for bioenergy use. All emissions from fuel combustion and emissions from fertilizer production, lubricant production, any emissions of carbon that might come from the site, from the soil, and so on. So these are the kind of things that we're going to measure in a life cycle inventory. And you might get the idea that this is not something that you're going to do on a Friday afternoon. This is a fairly complicated process. It can be fairly expensive, and that's important. You know, we'll talk about in a little while why that's important. Okay, so part of this is that before you go very far, you got to select what is the functional unit, what is the output here. So what I've shown is we've got logs on a truck. So in this case, the primary product we're looking at is logs, all right? And logs means saw logs. Byproducts or co-products would be things like pulpwood. Pulpwood would be a co-product. Logging slash, if we're collecting that for bioenergy, would be a co-product. And so our primary product here is going to be logs on a truck. So we would look at this and say, okay, what is our unit of measure? In Minnesota, we sometimes use cords, even for saw bolts. We might use 100 cubic feet or cubic meters. But you want to select an output value that is going to be fairly consistent. So I tend to shy away from things like green tons. I prefer something like a dry ton equivalent because it's more reproducible and measurable, or even cubic meters. But in any case, you need to select a functional unit and then stick with that. I mentioned here that you would have products and byproducts. So if we're measuring the environmental impact of producing logs, now we've got these other products over here, and what do you do with those? Well, what you do with those is those products are really, you think about those separately, and so you allocate environmental impacts to these various products. So a portion of the impact will be allocated to pulpwood, a portion to logging slash if you're collecting it for energy, and usually that allocation is done based on value. All right, so you look into the life cycle inventory and you get an output. Now this is an output for plywood production. If you look at the very top of your screen in red there, this is plywood production from the Pacific Northwest. And so, you know, it doesn't have to do with this example I'm giving here today, but it gives you an example of the kind of output. So on the left is our inputs in green. So you see the inputs to plywood production are wood and resin and all different kind of things that go to making plywood. And then energy is an input, and you keep track of what kind of energy is it that goes in there, because the impacts linked to different kinds of energy are different. For example, wind energy, hydro energy has very low impact. If you're producing energy from coal, it's a far different impact. So you keep track of those things. What is the form of energy? And then you look over here in outputs in blue on the right side of the screen. And in this case, if you're producing plywood, well, you get as a byproduct, you get bark coming out that you're going to do something with. Plywood is the principal product, and then you get co-products like chips and peeler core and things like that. They're going to go somewhere. And then you get emissions to air, and you can see a whole list of things. And this is only a partial list. In producing plywood, you probably have something like 300 or 400 different emissions kind of things. And then you see parts per emissions per 1,000 square feet, and so on. All right, so that's the kind of output you get, and so you get this whole bunch of data. It's like, okay, holy smokes, what did I do with all of these numbers? So we'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay, so we've done our life cycle inventory, and we get a whole bunch of data coming out. And as you look at this list of stuff, you know, we're looking at inputs, and then we look at outputs over here. You look at the outputs, notice, I mean, we're talking about products, we're talking about emissions, but nowhere on that list is there anything about measures of landscape impact. So things like visual impact, erosion potential, stream sedimentation, soil depletion, biodiversity impact, they're not on that list. And so why is that? We'll talk about that a bit. So remember that LCI, life cycle assessment, and then life cycle inventory is all about more or less precisely measurable, reproducible data that gets away from subjective measurement, that gets away from intuition, bias, all that other kinds of stuff. When you start getting into things that have to be subjectively measured and which are highly dependent upon how different people might view the world, then you're getting outside the central intent of life cycle assessment. All right, and so the next thing we'll do, we'll talk a little bit about, okay, well, how does that get handled then? Because these are obviously important kinds of impacts linked to forestry. So again, these are subjective kinds of measures for the most part and not easily encompassed by life cycle assessment. So the solution here is that when you look at the world, there are a lot of people who look at life cycle assessment today, and what they want to come out as a result is one number. They want to say producing XYZ is a 83, and producing this in a different way is a 92, and so this is better. Well, the world's not quite that simple, and so the proper way to look at LCA is that it's one tool in a toolkit that you use to assess environmental impact. And it's very powerful because it's measurable, reproducible, and so on, but it doesn't cover everything. The site level impacts, the kind of things we talked about, they are properly covered by something like third-party forest certification. And if you put LCA and forest certification together, that's a very powerful combination. And by the way, there's only one product. If you're building a house or a commercial building and you want to obtain raw materials for which there is life cycle assessment information available in the form of something called environmental product declarations, and you want third-party certified material, there's only one material that offers those to you, and that's wood. You can't get it in steel, any other kind of metal. You can't get it in plastic, glass, or anything else. It's only available if you trade in wood and forest products. So as indicated, LCA is just one tool in the assessment toolkit, and certification is another, and together they're dynamite. I don't know how many of you have seen the North American softwood lumber environmental product declaration. Environmental product declarations are life cycle assessment based declarations of environmental impacts of stuff. And so North American softwood lumber industry has produced environmental product declarations. And here's the front page of this declaration, which says, this environmental product declaration includes life cycle assessment results for all processes up to the point that planed and dry lumber is packaged and ready for shipment at the manufacturing gate. Well, this has caused some consternation amongst some environmental groups because they look at that language there, and then they look through this environmental product declaration, and they see things like this. So we'll just talk about this for a few minutes. So here it says that the product profile presented, and the declared unit here is 1 cubic meter of kiln-dried lumber. Remember, you got to declare your functional unit. In this case, it's a cubic meter of kiln-dried lumber, and it's planed softwood lumber. And then down at the bottom it says, this environmental product declaration is based on a life cycle assessment that considered the entire range of softwood lumber sizes, weighted towards 2x4 and 2x6, because they're by far the greatest part of production. And so we look at different parts of the LCA. And so here's a good example of LCA results. So this tells us, in looking at softwood lumber, kiln-dried, coming out, we have global warming potential, acidification potential, eutrophication, the dead zone issue, ozone depletion potential, smog potential. Then we look at measures of not renewable and non-renewable energy that are used, measures of total raw materials used, impacts to fresh water, and those kinds of things, measures of solid waste. So this is what's reported. And so, that's what you find in this report. And remember, this report begins with a statement that says this is a full accounting based on life cycle assessment of environmental impacts. Well, once again, in this report, you don't see anything about water impacts to the landscape, the visual effects, the biodiversity. There's nothing in this report. And so critics look at this and say, well, this report should also say that, to find out about those impacts, you should buy certified timber. And, it's a point that I think has some validity. All right. So the next step, we've done a life cycle inventory. We've gathered a whole bunch of data And remember, it can be thousands of data points about different kinds of emissions and parts per million and so on. And so what do you do with that? Well, what you want to do is you want to use a life cycle inventory to make some practical kinds of decisions. Like, for instance, what is the global warming potential of what it is we just did? So remember, we start with a whole bunch of data that looks like this, which is pretty much totally useless to anybody, except a LCA practitioner, I guess. And what you do is you use the best available science. You look at these various emissions and so forth, and you find out, well, what does science tell us about these? And what we do is we boil all of those measures down to a fairly short list of things, maybe 10 or 12 different kind of measures. So these are common measures that come out of a life cycle inventory when you roll up all this data. Fossil fuel consumption, weighted resource use, climate change potential, which generally would be expressed as global warming potential, even though I know that's politically incorrect in some circles and probably even among some of the people listening here today. Anyway, smog potential, acidification potential, human health, respiratory effects, a little bit controversial because it's a little, the science on this is a little bit not as definitive sometimes as you want it to be. Photochemical oxidation, ozone layer depletion, water consumption, eutrophication, so on. Okay, so this now is a set of measures we can kind of get our hands around, and we can start, thinking in logical ways about, okay, we're doing these things, and these are the impacts of what it is we're doing. And then the next question will be, well, okay, what can we do about that? So the last step in this is to consider improvements, called the improvement assessment step. And so that is, we take life cycle inventory information, we roll it up into these measures that we can actually talk logically about, and then we begin to have discussion. It gives us a basis for having discussion about, well, what can we change? How can we reduce the environmental footprint of these things that we're doing? Can we somehow reduce the inputs? Can we be more energy efficient? Can we make the process more efficient so that we have less skid traffic and so on? Can we, what can we do? Can we extend the rotation? There's a lot of people looking at life cycle assessment results saying today, well, for carbon balance, maybe what should be done is to extend rotations, and that would increase total carbon storage capacity. All right, I'm going to stop here and see if anybody has any questions, and if you do, anybody in the room don't have any questions because they all know about all this stuff. I think, especially one guy in the back. But use the chat box and send questions in. And anything coming in, Eli?
No, we don't have any questions yet, Jim. Folks should be able to either use the Q&A pod, which you should see. If you're on full screen view, you can click the blue bar at the top to make those things appear. Go ahead and send those Q&A, just submit it, or send them to, I think it's in as Eli Questions Sagor. Those will come to me. But Jim, we don't have any at this time, so.
All right, well,
go ahead.
You either got everybody confused or explaining this really well, I guess. All right, so we're going to talk about forest carbon dynamics, and I'm not close enough to forestry per se, to the forestry field per se these days to know what the discussion is amongst foresters about this, but I can tell you that in policy circles that I'm working in over the last few years, this is a huge discussion right now. And so let's talk about this a little bit. In terms of carbon, there has been a debate within the Environmental Protection Agency that goes back almost the beginning of the Obama administration about, there are some people who say, well, carbon is carbon. And there are other people like me who say, wait a minute, there's a difference in that some carbon, i.e. that which comes from fossil fuels, is carbon that was sequestered a long time ago, millions of years ago, and through human activity, we're releasing it. And basically, when we extract and burn fossil fuels, or when we make cement, we're releasing a lot of fossil carbon. On the other hand, forests in a relatively short time span, decades, perhaps hundreds of years, that biomass contains carbon, about half by dry weight, half of its dry weight is carbon, which was sequestered a relatively short time ago. And that is part of an ongoing carbon cycle that's been in place for thousands of years, in which carbon is sequestered, released, resequestered, and so on and so on. Now, there are those who point out that fossil carbon can be sequestered by trees just as biogenic carbon can be. I'll put names on these two things. I'll call this one fossil carbon, the other biogenic carbon. That trees and so forth can capture fossil carbon. They certainly can, but there's no denying the fact that when we're adding carbon to the carbon cycle, about 6 billion tons a year through making of cement and burning of fossil fuels, there's no question about what it's adding to the burden of carbon in the whole system, and the sequestration, the potential for sequestering carbon within oceans and within trees and so forth is being challenged right now. A lot of the carbon the extra carbon that's being emitted is being captured, but it's creating some other issues. All right, so here's part of the big debate now. Some of you who are older will remember, perhaps, if you go back to the 1980s, there was a discussion about national forests, and there was a concept that developed that national forests should be managed according to non-declining even flow. It was an interesting concept, and it didn't take very long before groups seized on this and said, oh, well, then we should have non-declining even flow on every acre. And what that meant was that you need to have a non-declining volume on every acre. And when you interpreted things that way, it meant you couldn't ever harvest anywhere if you wanted to have, an even flow of things. And the same kind of discussion now is playing out with respect to carbon. So it goes like this. Do we start counting carbon in a forest stand at the time trees are planted, at the time a stand is established through natural regeneration following harvest? Or do we start counting carbon at the time harvest takes place? That's one question. The next question is, at what scale do we count carbon? Do we account for carbon? Is it at the plot level, the place where the tree we just harvested? Is it at the stand level? Is it at the landscape level? And the answer to that question has huge implications for forest policy, and that's playing out every day. So there's one group out there within the scientific community who want to look at the stump where the tree was harvested and just pretty much look at that stump and then count the time it takes to restore the carbon to that specific place in the landscape. There are others who would look at the stand that tree is harvested from, the management unit where harvest takes place, and look at that and look at that site and say, okay, well, that's the area. We need to look at that site and determine how long it takes to restore the carbon that we took off in a harvest. And then there's another view, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But so if we make these 4 assumptions, there's been no purposeful accumulation of carbon through the life of a stand, if you assume that that's the case. So in other words, that might be the case if we've got a virgin forest stand that's never before been harvested, or it's never been purposefully managed. Second, that carbon accounting properly begins at the time of harvest. Thirdly, that the proper scale of consideration is right at the site or stand level. And fourthly, if we give no consideration to carbon benefits or products. So what we get is this, and this is called a carbon debt. And this is, again, a pretty huge deal out there in the lifecycle assessment world anyway. So the idea is, if you look at the left here, so here's the stand, And so we're going to take this wood off in the form of harvest. And if we're going to take residues off to use them for bioenergy, so these things are 50% carbon by dry weight. So you're going to take those off the site. So here's your baseline up here. And so the argument would be then, all right, you've taken these off, and at that point in time, you have a carbon debt. And then over time, oh, my arrow just disappeared here. Okay. Oh, there it is. And then over time, as the forest regrows, you know, you're coming back to repay the carbon debt. And at some point out in here, the debt is repaid, and then you can go through this again. Now, of course, another way to look at this, if this were a forest that were previously specifically managed to produce products, or one that was specifically planted, another way to look at this, you'd say, well, okay, so this forest grew over time. You know, there was an accumulation of stuff on the site. We harvested it, so we took the interest that had accumulated in this account, and so we would have no carbon debt at the time of harvest. Now, there's two ways to look at the same ball of wax. Here's another look at the carbon debt issue, and in this case, all of those, I'll go back to this list. In this case, the first three assumptions hold, but in this case, consideration is being given the carbon benefits of products. So here is a graphic that came out of something called the Management Center. So here we are. Here's the baseline. We harvest trees. So then the trees start to regrow. But what we're comparing here, this is harvest for bioenergy. So here's carbon released from burning fossil fuel. So we have to go out to the point where we equal that amount of carbon emissions, and then we say the debt is repaid. And then everything beyond that is a carbon benefit. And by the way, you get a carbon benefit thereafter forever, because now you start to manage the stand and so on. And then if you want to get really kind of into the weeds on this issue, we're looking at carbon here again. So here is growing trees, all right? And so we lose all that carbon. But of course, we do something with the wood that's harvested. So we've got wood that goes into products here in the blue. We've got wood that's used for bioenergy, so we're displacing emissions that would have come from fossil fuels. And we got some other things going on. And what we find out is, if we count carbon that's in products and the buildup of those in the landscape over time, what we get is continually increasing carbon if we look at products coming off the site and if we look at this through multiple rotations. Then there's one more factor to consider, and that is if we use wood instead of something else, if we build a building out of wood instead of steel, there's a huge savings in that wood emissions tied to wood construction are far lower than they are with steel. And so if we count substitution effects, then we get a carbon increase line that looks not like this, but rather like this. And you can show huge differences in carbon. So anyway, that's a debate that's playing out in an important way. And how this is going to turn out has not yet been determined. But those arguing for carbon debt basically say that it takes 30 to even hundreds of years to repay a carbon debt. And others say, well, that's not really the right way to look at the world. So let me show you this in one other way. And we'll focus on the issue of how do you measure, at what level do you measure carbon? So here's what we've been talking about so far. We're going to talk about carbon from the stand level. So here's a forest stand, and whatever this time scale is, let's say in Minnesota we might be on what, an 80-year rotation. So the forest stand grows here. I'm going to assume we're not doing any intermediate thinnings here. So the forest stand grows, we get to rotation age, we harvest the stand, and then we accumulate carbon again, and so on and so on. On the other hand, we might look at this from a broader perspective. What about the forest parcel? So now the harvest block is here, and it's part of a bigger management unit, and which we progressively harvest these different areas. Now the effect on carbon looks much less dramatic. Yes, we're taking out carbon at the time of harvest, but there's a lot of carbon that's unaffected because they're in these other units. And then if we look at the landscape level, what we see, as long as we've got a forest in which growth is at least equal to harvest, we see a situation in which carbon within a stand is staying quite level. So you can make your own decision if you look at these three different arguments, what makes the most sense. The forestry community, for the most part, is arguing that the proper way to look at this is at the landscape level, and point out, in fact, in the United States and in Minnesota, carbon is accumulating, in fact, much faster than it's being removed. So the picture looks even more positive than this. Our carbon picture looks more like that, and so on. So anyway, that's part of the big debate that's going on, that life cycle assessment is the only way to really accurately measure what's going on in terms of carbon flows in forests. And that's a central debate that's related to LCA. So just to sum up here, environmental impacts, you really can't determine this through intuition. That was a kind of a method used for a long time by lots of folks, but LCA is a much better approach to measuring environmental impacts. If you use proper international protocols, you can produce unbiased, reproducible information about environmental impacts that's really, you can hang your hat on. It's reproducible and done in accordance with the best science. But LCA does not include measures of landscape impact or impacts to flora and fauna, and so it's necessary to think in terms of, if you really want to know what the impacts are, what you're doing, you do need some kind of additional process to look at that. And with that, I'll stop and see if there are any questions now.
Great. Well, Jim, thank you. I've got a couple of questions here. We'll see if any come in from online, and others may have questions as well. So you mentioned that the only material, if you're looking at most buildings, the only material for which an EPD is available, environmental product declaration, is wood.
Correct.
But wood is certainly not the only material used, and in many, especially large buildings, it's maybe a relatively small component. So why, well, I guess there are a few questions around that. Why haven't those EPDs been developed for other products? And how, I think if we're able to compare those, I think it tells a story that's fairly favorable to the work that many of our participants here are involved in. And how can we further that conversation?
Okay, so I'm glad you asked that question, because it indicates I didn't explain this quite clearly enough. Environmental product declaration, the wood industry was the first industry to produce LCA-based environmental product declarations. Competing industries now have those, steel, concrete, but we're the only industry for which there is third-party certification of extraction. And at the time that the whole idea of certification was born, and that came from the Forest Stewardship Council, in the very same year that that council was formed, there was also the Mining Stewardship Council was also formed in Washington, D.C. It never went anywhere because the industry simply dug in their heels and said, there's no way in the world we're going to do this. It's impossible, so on and so on. Well, the forest industry said the same thing. If you remember, I remember very clearly back when, and so do people here, when certification started, our industry said the same thing, but nonetheless, we came together and figured out how you do a third-party certification with oversight from third parties and looking at what we do. And so we're way ahead of the rest of the world. There's no doubt in my mind that third-party oversight is coming to other industries, but not without a lot of kicking and screaming yet. We're going to see that play out, I think, in the future.
I have a couple of others, but. All right, just a reminder to folks online, use the Q&A or send your questions to Eli Questions Sagor. And I will say that I have not received any questions online. So if you have submitted one, maybe try if you've used the chat pod, try the Q&A. Make sure you can get those to us. So Jim, you mentioned the combination of certification. You've talked at some length about that. Certification and LCA. So, but certification is a very different thing. So is the idea that LCA gives us, measurable, reproducible, narrows it down to maybe not a single number, but measures along 10 or 12 outcome type indicators. Certification is the idea just that certification gives us confidence that the methods by which the things that are not measured in LCA, the kinds of impacts created there are at least known and are done in a way that is in accordance with a set of standards that we can go and read. So we don't get outputs in the same type of outputs from certification, but is the idea simply that we get something that's
you're asking perfect questions, and they're pointing out things that I didn't explain well enough. So here's another one. I'm glad you asked it. I said in discussing that I talk about why landscape impacts are not included in LCA. Remember, an LCA is a pretty expensive thing to do, and you really when you actually carry beyond woods operations and you get into a plant, I mean, you're literally climbing up smokestacks and you're measuring emissions and you're looking at outputs that or companies have collected this data, and you're just gathering all this kind of data. Very expensive to do. An LCA can easily cost $100,000 or more to do. You have to update them every 5 years. If there's any change, any marked change in your process, you've got to do it before that. As soon as a change takes place, it might change your life cycle impacts. But in a mill environment or in most environments, the environmental impacts are pretty predictable from one operation to the next. Even if you do, I mentioned earlier that life cycle assessments have been done of forestry operations all across the country, but they are done specifically in specific areas of the country with specific species and terrain types, so that those are pretty reproducible kinds of things. You can get an average number that works pretty well. Now, what about site impacts? How does that work? We all know that if you harvest timber in different kinds of sites that can even be within miles of each other, you can get different kinds of impacts, especially if you're looking at slope. If you're looking at west and south facing slope as opposed to north and east facing slope, there are different things that go on there. If you're running a mining operation, you can have vastly different impacts on one microsite versus another where you're mining. And so you can't afford to go in and do a full LCA with each harvest operation that's done. That would be completely impossible. It would be completely prohibitively expensive. And so the idea is that you're dealing with two issues here. On the landscape level, for the most part, you're looking at things that are not precisely measurable, especially if you're making a decision about a landscape impact or making a general decision about what is the effect on biodiversity. Maybe that is quantifiable, maybe it isn't, but for the most part, you're looking at subjective kinds of things, and you're looking at measures that can change significantly from specific site to specific site. So anyway, that's kind of the difference between those two things. Now, your question was, how do these two things fit together? Well, they fit together in that the kinds of issues that are addressed by certification do not fit well. They're not precisely measurable. They don't fit well with LCA. So if you want some measure of confidence that the forest harvest that you've created by measuring XYZ product has minimal impact, or you want to get some idea what the impact is, you need this and you need this.
Thank you. We do have a couple of questions online. I'll respond to one here. And Jim, there's a request for you. Would you please show the summary slide again? associated with that question is, will this presentation be available to participants offline? I see it's being recorded. The answer to that is yes. We will send out a follow-up email within a couple of days once we've got the recording published. The recording will be published to the event webpage on the Sustainable Forest Education Co-op site, the same page that you used to register for this event. So it'll appear there as soon as we can get it posted. Here's the summary slide. Jim put it up. Question, would it be more appropriate, this is from Cloquet, would it be more appropriate to start with a carbon surplus for the forest growth since stand initiation? In other words, start at stand initiation rather than at harvest when accounting for carbon?
Yeah, and that is a question that's being asked today, and I think the answer to that is yes and no. If harvesting is taking place, we're doing a project right now in the southeast U.S. I'm about to run out of my voice here, and so the question there is, all right, if you're harvesting hardwoods for biomass, and those stands have never been managed before for anything. I mean, they're just kind of a wild hardwood stand and so on. And you're coming through there and harvesting that for biomass. Where does carbon accounting start? In that case, I would argue it starts at point harvest. I mean, I think that's quite proper. On the other hand, if you're looking at a pine plantation, which is quite common in the southeast, and that you're in maybe your fourth rotation, then to me, clearly carbon accounting starts at time of planting. And you're taking off interest rather than, and a lot of, well, several recent studies have looked at that and concluded that that's, in fact, that makes a lot of sense. I see that water on the way, and this is badly needed.
Water boy.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Jim, we do have one more question that I see here, and that is, I think, from Grand Rapids. How does LCI measure loss or release of carbon from forest soils during logging operations?
Well, a life cycle inventory would take into account loss of soil, if that's included in the system boundary, by the way. Remember, we talked about system boundaries earlier, but if measurement of carbon flows from the forest is included, then we would look around to see wherever there is information available, research that's been done on carbon emissions. So again, we couldn't do that on an individual harvest basis, but what would be done is to look at forest sites and look at what is the effect on carbon, both what is the carbon level in the soil carbon before harvest and what is it after harvest. Now, in saying that, I would say that I mentioned earlier that there's been a number of life cycle assessments done of forest operations, and to date, none of those have included consideration of forest carbon. But increasingly, the forest carbon question, the forest soils carbon, is being asked. And so I think we're likely to see that included in studies in the future, at least consideration of that in the future.
Thank you. A question from online. To what degree are you seeing LCA process and results impacting policy discussions in state or federal legislative or regulatory functions?
Well, LCA is a big deal today. I can tell you one area where it's playing out quite dramatically, and that is if you've been paying attention to the tall wood buildings development, and you may be also aware that the federal government under the previous administration put a lot of incentives in place to facilitate the building of tall wood buildings to kind of change the whole dynamic in that industry. And in that case, life cycle assessment results showing that the carbon implications of building with wood instead of tall buildings out of dominantly steel and concrete has enormous positive carbon benefits. And really, it's been the availability, I think, of scientifically rigorous, reproducible information that's really carried the day in that discussion. And it's caused a change in forest policy, in federal policy relative to to non-residential construction. Increasingly, now we're embedded in this whole big debate about forest carbon. What does this mean for harvesting forests? And the debate goes all the way across the spectrum, from people saying that forests should not be harvested at all, that we should just manage them for accumulation of carbon, to people who say we would benefit from actively managing forests, from taking carbon out of those forests, creating new carbon pools on the landscape, actively managing those forests so we maintain carbon levels. And the debate goes from here to here, and that debate is not completely played out yet. But I think systematic assessment is going to have a big role in how decisions are made. To the extent that our government still uses science in making decisions, I guess.
Those are all the questions that I'm seeing online. If anyone out there has additional questions or comments that you'd like to pass along, I'm going to ask that you please use the Q&A system. You'll see that, you should see that at the top of your screen. If you're in full screen view, just pull down that blue tab at the top of your screen and you should see Q&A. And I'll keep watching the screen here for a moment. Looks like we have a question here in St. Paul. Yeah, go ahead.
Jim, if I went to a certification system, or if I look at different certification systems, they have somewhat different standards. They measure things a little differently. Is that true also for LCA?
So the question, and I'm not sure everybody could hear it there, the question was, if you look at different certification systems, they all have different ways, slightly different ways of looking at things and don't measure precisely the same things. And the question was, is that true in LCA for different LCA models and things? The answer is no. Lifecycle assessment, very early on, there were a set of international protocols, internationally agreed to protocols that were developed through ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. And then those standards have been tweaked over the years. But to do an LCA, you must follow, to do an ISO compliant LCA, you must follow that protocol. And that's what allows you to compare one study to another. It allows people in different parts of the world to study the same thing and get the same kind of answer. You will occasionally, LCA is a way of scientifically producing results, but that's not to say that there aren't different people trying to play games with LCA, and we see it all the time. An important question you have to ask right away when you pick up an LCA to read results: is this ISO compliant? And if it isn't, you got to have your antenna out. But for instance, the cement industry did 3 studies of LCA, and I think I've read every LCA study done on tall wood buildings, of buildings of any kind that's ever been done in the world, I think. And they all show the same thing, that wood construction is far better than other things, certainly than concrete. And these 3 studies show that concrete was better. So I saw the study and said, okay, something's wrong. What did they do? And what they did in that case was the rules for comparing things in LCA, you have to compare functionally equivalent things. That's one of the principal rules. So functionally equivalent, what's a functionally equivalent building? Well, it's got to be the same size, it's got to perform the same function, and it's got to have the same thermal equivalence, right? So what they did in those 3 studies was they produced a concrete building that had a higher thermal rating than wood. So I said, yeah, there's a difference, initially, that wood's far better, but over time, the concrete building's better. Well, so you looked at it and you found out, well, the wood building, they just designed a leakier wood building, so the overtime operational energy overwhelmed embodied energy and embodied carbon kind of thing. So the answer to the question is no. If you follow international protocols, you've got comparable things, but you got to make sure you're dealing with an ISO compliant system. So,
All right.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, Jim, thank you very much. I appreciate the talk. And for those folks online or at a broadcast site, as I said before, we will be sending out a recording very soon. We should have it posted within a few days. So again, thanks for coming. The webinars are offered by the University of Minnesota Extension Forestry Group and the Sustainable Forest Education Co-op. Next month, we'll hear from Jody Provost on a talk that's a little bit more oriented toward woodland owners, talking about relationships between forest management and timber harvesting. In July, we'll hear a talk that's kind of similar, but we'll go into FIA data, look at more of a systems level rather than a site level, with Mark Nelson from the Forest Service. He's an FIA analyst. That's in January. Again, looking at kind of how our forests are changing and the role of forest management and relationships between forest management and wildlife habitat. In June, at kind of a site level, looking at family forest lands, and in July, looking at more of a systemic level across a major part of the state. Again, Jim Bowyer from Dovetail, thank you for joining us. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we're going to sign off.